If you haven't read Lost Connections, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. If I was to pick, it's not my favourite book of all time. My favourite books would be Shantaram would probably be my number one. That's the only book that's made me cry still to this day. That is a fantastic read, an absolute ripping read. So Shantaram would be my number one. Sapiens is right up there. Obviously, if you want fiction, then you know there's A Song of Ice and Fire I really love. There's a number of other books that I like around that kind of, you know. But as far as books that I think people should read, not because it's my favourite book, but because of the level of importance, there's two books that I would put far and away, hands down, above the rest. And they are How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. So Dale Carnegie was a business leader in the 1900s, and in the early 1900s, he wrote a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People, and it's basically like a day-to-day field guide of how to be a good person. It really is that. It is how to win people over. How to win friends and influence people sounds very much like you're trying to do something that's a little shady. How do I trick people into liking me? That's how it reads to me. Maybe it doesn't read like that to others, but that's how it sounds. But the book is just it's a full godsend. I remember I read it. I read it when I was working for my dad doing some construction stuff. I was doing this big roof. Imagine a house in where it was. It was in Sorrento, really nice part of the world where I grew up. Really lots of people that are quite well off down there. It was a massive house, and I was left to put this roof on by myself, and I was stoked. I was like, yep, this is awesome. So I just plugged a headphone in, and I just went about spending the next few days chipping away, working away, and listening to podcasts and audiobooks. I love nothing more than to be doing whatever I'm doing and to have a headphone in, because I feel like I'm always learning, and I feel like that's a great position to be in, and it's a superpower to always be reading and always be learning. I really think that. Just a way to forever be bettering yourself. But How to Win Friends and Influence People had the biggest impact on me, that I promised myself, and I haven't followed through with this promise, but I promised myself that I'd read it every 6 months just to ground myself and remind myself on how to positively impact everyone around me, you know, like the littlest things. You know, looking someone in the eyes, listening when they talk to you, asking more questions than statements you make about yourself or about, you know, your thoughts. Being inquisitive, really caring about people, just the smallest things, remembering people's names. I'm terrible. I have a shit memory. And I've spoken about this before on the podcast at some point, but I write people's names in my phone. If I roll into a new community, so if I go to a gym and there's 200 people for me to meet, I'm like, fuck, this is going to be fucking hard work. So what I do is I introduce myself to somebody, and then I make a note about that person. Mark, skinny, funny pond bloke. Sarah, funny redheaded girl, likes podcasts. Clint, crazy cat lover dude, bit of a weirdo, but nice guy. You know, like that kind of stuff. And anyway, so I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but How to Win Friends and Influence People is the first book I would recommend to people to read to improve their life in general. I think it's the most important book written in the 20th century. Not that I've read them all. I've said that before as well on the podcast. But I really do think that's the case. Then I believe that the most important book that is written so far in the 21st century is the book that I'm talking about today, and that's Lost Connections by Johann Hari. I believe that when all is said and done, in 100 years' time, when I'm well past and everybody, you know, that grew up around me is probably, you know, it's their children and grandchildren's children that are reading all these books. I believe that How to Win Friends and Influence People will stand the test of time, and Lost Connections will also stand the test of time and will be looked upon as the most important book written in the 21st century. Now, I hope that that's kind of not the case, because if that's not the case, then maybe the rest of the 21st century, from this point onwards and into the 2020s and 2030s and 2040s, this mental health epidemic, mental health crisis, isn't as prevalent as it is right now. If that's the case, then Lost Connections might not end up being that important of a book. But for me, for this particular period in time that we're in right now, I believe it's the most important book written. I read a lot, I really do, especially in the self-development realm and new age philosophy or whatever it is. I read a shitload. And I'm sure there are lots of other fantastic books out there that are of similar vein, and that people could, hold a candle up and say, this is the most important book written, and that's fine. But for me, Lost Connections is that book. So anyway, Johann Hari is an English gentleman who grew up basically a typical English childhood, and he went through his own trials and tribulations with his mental health, getting to the point where I haven't read the book in a little while, so I don't want to go too far into paraphrasing Johann's life, but getting to the point where he was suicidal and he wasn't happy with his life at all, and so on and so forth, and then trying to pull his way back out from that, and basically it's the story of the things that he learned, and his thoughts after dedicating, as a journalist, after dedicating much of his life to figuring out what's going on with this mental health epidemic. He formulated his thoughts, and he broke them down into 7 lost connections, so to speak. So if you think of 7 lost connections that are the reasons that we are basically, that there's so much unhappiness and there's a lack of wellness across the world, really, across the Western world anyway. His lost connections, I'll read them just quickly. So his lost connections are a lost connection and disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from people. So the disconnections. Disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from people, disconnection from meaningful values, disconnection from childhood trauma, disconnection from status and respect, disconnection from a natural world, and disconnection from a hopeful and secure future. So, as I said, in the last episode that I recorded regarding this book, I talked really negatively about how silly we are and how the society that we've found ourselves in basically reflects those lost or those disconnections, I should say.